Welcome back to part 2 of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Mr. Sheets radio station. So, this is St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, I believe, 2020. Yes. So, at this point, please get your notes out, and we're going to continue this from yesterday. So, you should have the worksheet done at this point, half of your notes completed at this point, and then we're going to finish this now. So you know JFK's options. He had four options. He could engage in further negotiations with Khrushchev. Your answer should have been something like, this option, although peaceful, would give the Soviets more time to finish building the missile bases. It also risked making Kennedy look hesitant and weak in the face of the bold Soviet move. His second option would be to invade Cuba. This would eliminate the missile threat and achieve the additional goal of ousting Fidel Castro. A Cuban invasion had failed before with the Bay of Pigs, uh, and this plan risked all-out nuclear war with the Soviets. So yeah, we could invade Cuba, but if we do that, we've already failed once. And if we succeed this time, then all the Russians and Cuba would have to do is launch nukes at us. Number 3, the option could be to blockade Cuba, which means surround Cuba with our naval ships so that the Russians can't access Cuba. This action would prevent Soviet ships from making further missile deliveries. It would force Khrushchev either to back off or to take aggressive action against US warships. However, no one knew how the Soviet leader might react to this step. So if we formed a naval blockade of Cuba, we didn't really know what Khrushchev was going to do. And then finally, we could bomb the missile sites. A series of airstrikes could quickly knock out the missiles, yet would the Soviets launch a counterstrike, and where? So as you see here, every single one of those four options from your worksheet involve a massive degree of risk. And think of which one of those four think of which one of those four JFK probably chooses if you don't already know. So look at those four options and think, which one is JFK going to choose? You can pause the video if you're not done thinking, but the correct answer is number 3. He's going to blockade Cuba. When JFK blockades Cuba, he's very nervous, and the rest of the world is also very nervous because we don't know how Khrushchev is going to react. If Khrushchev orders his ships to fire on American naval ships, within minutes, nuclear bombs are going to be flying through the air. Within minutes, Cuba is going to be launching nuclear bombs at the United States, and Russia on the other side of the world will also be doing this. We are totally prepared to fire back, but there's this thing which we'll talk about called mutually assured destruction, which is where if we do go to war, we're both done for. So let's see what happens. And JFK is actually so nervous during this blockade that there's evidence that he was outside. He kept having to run out and puke. Okay, let's continue where we left off. But remember, begin taking notes when we begin here. So here's where we left off yesterday. Just a little recap. Russia has a new ally. Fidel Castro is this Cuban communist dictator. This is what he looks like. So there's Fidel Castro. He's taken over Cuba. He is a Cuban. He's a communist Cuban who's taken over. And he is now allies with Russia. And so Russia puts nuclear bombs in Cuba just like we were putting nuclear bombs in Turkey in Europe. So the U.S. forms this blockade. Make sure you have this down. The U.S. forms a naval quarantine of Cuba. Now, they didn't call it a blockade because a blockade would be an act of war, just like Germany was doing to Europe in World War I, like blowing up the Lusitania. That could be considered a blockade. So we called it a quarantine There's a word everybody should know by now. Anyway, JFK orders U.S. Navy to block all Russian ships from entering Cuba. So here are some Russian ships, and they are being blocked from entering Cuba. Nuclear war will happen if the USSR fired upon our Navy ships. Like I said, JFK was very nervous, and the whole world was just kind of freaking out and on the edge. Like like I've said, this is the closest the world has ever came to nuclear annihilation. So here is a map. Uh-oh. Here's a map. So here's Cuba, and you see these Soviet missile sites all over Cuba. Your precious Disney World is up here. Uh, it's not there yet at this point in time. Anyway, so here's the missile sites, and this purple line here is not a cold front, but it is the U.S. blockade. So we have blocked all of this section from the Russians. They can't penetrate this blockade here. And if they do fire on any of our ships, it's over. We're all going to be cavemen. This is the DEF CON rating system. So right now, the United States is on DEF CON 5, I believe. Maybe DEF CON 4, I don't know. But we're not expecting a nuclear war right now. But in history, if you see all these, DEF CON 1 is meaning the president has the big red button on his desk and he's about to press it. DEF CON 2 is the next step. It means that armed forces are ready to deploy and engage in less than 6 hours. DEF CON 3 is an increase in force readiness that the above there. I don't know. That's a messed up sentence there. You get the point. So, have we ever been to DEF CON 1? The answer is yes. I'll explain that in a moment. But on 9/11, we were on DEF CON 3. We were ready to mobilize in 15 minutes, and we were probably warming up the nukes just in case something bigger was going to happen. Have we ever been to DEF CON 2? Yes. I believe the only time we've been to DEF CON 2 was the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this real world situation, we've only been to DEF CON 2 or during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we're talking about now. And then, have we ever been to DEF CON 1? The answer is yes, we've been to DEF CON 1 one time. It's a pretty interesting story. So, we have a new satellite. We have a new satellite radar system in 1960. Um, and the satellite system, the radar system, is reporting that hundreds of nuclear bombs are flying from Russia towards the United States. And so we are almost ready to fire these missiles back at the Soviet Union. And then, as we're readying these nukes to fire, someone points out that Khrushchev, the leader of Russia, is actually in New York City at the time. And so we're like, why would Russia send the nuclear bombs to blow up America and New York City, most definitely, if Khrushchev, their leader, is already in New York City? And so they're like, okay, hold on, let's see what's happening. And it turned out to be a full moon coming up over the east. So it looked like the full moon's light was tricking the radar system into making us think that it was nukes coming from Russia. So dodged a bullet there. So here's a picture of JFK, and you can see how stressed out he is over this Cuban Missile Crisis deal. You're the most powerful man in the world trying to prevent a nuclear war, and you're doing everything you can to protect your country. And Russia just continues acting aggressively by putting these nukes on in Cuba. Um, you can see how afraid he must have been, knowing that any wrong decision that he makes could be the end of the world for everybody and cause millions and millions of deaths and endless amounts of suffering. So it's a pretty scary time to be a president. So here is our blockade line, and this is the climactic point where we are waiting to see if Russia is going to fire on us. So the moment is very tense. You have um, two Russian ships here full of missiles, and you have the Yuri Gagarin, which is a ship named after the first man in space. And I don't know what this is, but that's my birthday. But anyway, as you can see, in on October 23rd, they're they're inching their way closer to Cuba down here, and there's lots of American ships blocking them. Now we fully expect this war to take place, this great naval battle, and then a nuclear war. But something absolutely amazing happens. The next day, they turned around and they went back to Russia. How exciting, right? You feel like something big's going to happen. You're all preparing for nuclear war, and then the Russian ships just turn around. They say it's not worth it. So there you have it, just like the Berlin airlift, where we expected a war with Stalin because we were dropping planes or dropping chocolate and food to the kids of Berlin. He didn't shoot our plane down because he didn't want a nuclear war. And now you have this, where the Russian ships just turn around because they don't want nuclear war. This sets the precedent for our lives today. We can't have big wars anymore because of these nukes. And I've said that a million times, I know, but that's the whole mm, main point behind learning about the Cold War. It's not a hot war because no one's fighting, it's a Cold War because it's just fist shaking. No one wants to die. There's no winner in a nuclear war. This is a movie that you should watch if you're super bored. Um, find this movie. It's called 13 Days. It's not a documentary. It's a movie. It's pretty entertaining. It pretty much covers everything I was just talking about. So, how does this crisis end? The United Nations, they get together after the world almost was totally destroyed, and the UN ordered Khrushchev to remove the missiles from Cuba. And so the USSR did. And Fidel Castro, the dictator of Cuba, is not happy about this. Um, so he goes to the UN and gives a 4 hour and 29-minute speech about why it was wrong that the United Nations ordered Russia to pull the missiles from Cuba. A lot of people say it was wrong because the United States didn't necessarily have to pull their missiles from Turkey at the time. So make sure you know how this Cuban Missile Crisis ended, okay? You need to know that, you don't need to know any of that, but you need to know that the blockade was formed, and you need to know what happened after the blockade was formed. The Russian ships just left, they turned around. And you need to know why they turned around, because mutually assured destruction, that's the word. If they fired on us, we were both goners, even your grandparents, if they were born yet. Know that the United Nations ordered Khrushchev to remove the missiles. You need to know the aftermath. So actually, believe it or not, relations between Russia and the United States improved after this because we realized that we weren't really getting anywhere by just fist shaking. So we actually started making some negotiations. So we formed a direct hotline. So this means that the US president and the USSR dictator now have a telephone where they can pick it up and be the only line there was to the Russian leader's office. I'm not sure if that's still a thing, but to put that, in the present day, Donald Trump could pick up a phone in the White House Oval Office, and the only other person on that line, it was a direct line to Vladimir Putin. So none of this middleman stuff. It's all just two guys talking. So it's very important to have, a level-headed ruler, and your opinion on who that is totally up to you. The NPT was also signed. This is important. You need to know this. This is where the nuclear arms race starts going down a little bit. It's called the Non Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. If you had me last year for Contemporary World Issues, we talked about this. You're no longer anyone that signed it is no longer allowed to spread and share nuclear bombs. You cannot send someone to a different country to teach them how to make nuclear bombs. And anyone that signs it agrees to disarm their own nuclear bombs eventually, but no one has completed the third vow. Not a single nuclear bomb was disarmed since this was signed. So it would almost be like, Russia and the United States both said, okay, we're going to take away our the nuclear bombs that we already created. Um, but it's almost like if you have, if two people have a gun pointed at each other, it's like you lower your gun and I'll lower mine. Of course, no one's going to lower their gun. So we agree eventually to disarm ourselves, but I doubt that ever happened. Now, what happened with Cuba? So this was USSR and USA relations aftermath. This is so they improved. The United States and Russia actually became closer friends, but the United States and Cuba became bigger enemies. So make sure that you know that we form an embargo of Cuban goods. You need to know what an embargo is, and this could be for any country. But the USA will not trade with Cuba, even today. Cuba becomes incredibly poor because of it, and Cuban cigars become illegal in the United States. Because Cuban cigars, a lot of cigar aficionados believe that Cuban cigars are very good. Um, so Cuba was making tons of money off of these cigars, and now the United States has stopped giving money to this communist regime. So we're going to take away anything that Cuba is good at making and make it illegal. So no Cuban products are sold in the United States because we're trying to bankrupt that country. Also, if you want to go to Cuba, you can't. Now there are ways you can go to Cuba. For example, you can say it's for a religious pilgrimage, but it's going to be a lot of work to get there. The United States does not let anyone go to Cuba with a U.S. passport because we don't want to give them any money. Now, if you're British or Chinese or Australian or pretty much anyone else in the world, you can go to Cuba. But if you're an American, the United States won't let you go to Cuba. Cuba will let you go to Cuba, but the United States will not let you go because they don't want you get it sharing money with that regime. And the USA will allow any Cuban who makes it to the US claim refugee status. So if you're Cuban and you want to escape communist Cuba, which is still considered a communist country today, if you want to escape Cuba, you have to get in a raft and or swim, which is unlikely. You're not going to make it if you swim. People have done it before, but if you make it to Florida, you instantly get refugee status because we're trying to take people away from Cuba. Let's watch this video. Here's this guy in Key West. This is the most southern point of the continental U.S. It says 90 miles to Cuba. As you can see, I lift. Now, here's some pictures of Cuba today. It's very poor, just as you would expect a communist country to be. But something you probably notice that's pretty cool about Cuba, and I hope I get to go someday to see this. But all the Cuban cars are from the Cuban Missile Crisis days because America makes the cars and then sent them to Cuba. You might see some Russian cars back here, but all these cars are American cars, I believe, and Cuba can't get hardly any new cars from the U.S. trade embargo, so they just keep having to use their old cars from the 1950s and 60s. So all these cars are in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Cuban people never gotten the chance to get new cars. So when you go to Cuba, it's just all kinds of new cars. Lots of people go, and then your rental car will be an old classic American car like this. Be cool. The Cuban cigars are still illegal in the United States. Now, here's some people that are on their way to the United States from Cuba. So lots of Cubans are desperate to escape. They'll come to Cuba, or they'll come to United States in any way they can. Miami has a huge Cuban population, lots of delicious Cuban food. So these guys are escaping the communist Cuban regime. Now, if they make it to the U.S., they become protected. They get refugee status. They get a green card. This woman here swam from Cuba to the United States a few years ago. We can watch this video. And I won't click these, but you still can't go to Cuba today. So Obama actually let Americans go to Cuba again, and then Trump, when he became president, he said that, yeah, no, we're not going to continue giving this regime money. They're still, evil communists. You're not allowed to go to Cuba. So that's that. So hopefully you have all the things that I told you to have in your notes. At this point in time, please email me the link or the worksheet that you were to do and title it Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm going to do some grading this weekend, and you'll be able to see what you're missing. Um, Thus far, all you need to submit was the space race worksheet, a picture of it. Your space race presentation should be added to Google Classroom. You did that on Friday. And finally, this worksheet. So that is today's work. Hope everyone's doing fine. If anyone has any recommendations on how to teach online better, as you can see, I'm learning quite a bit here. Something that other teachers are doing that you want me to do, just let me know. Email me. Also, make sure you're initialing the posts that I make. Just one initial a day where everyone else is initialing. I'll be posting every single day except weekends. So have a great St. Patrick's Day, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.